Any questions that you have, they don't have to be tied to the presentations today. Maybe you followed Jake for a while and want to ask him different questions about whatever, Cliff or any of us up here. So you can direct it at one person, you can direct it at the panel, it doesn't matter. So any questions that you have that you wanted answered, this is the time to go ahead and ask those. Now the thing is that we ask, especially if you're in the back, speak up really loud, like raise your voice up, because we are going to try and record this portion of it. So make sure you speak up and just direct it at whoever you want. So Abu, we'll go ahead and start with you.
I got a question for Wilson. Like, it doesn't really make a difference on whether you control it with, focus on negative going down or with contraction. Does it really make a difference in muscle growth or muscle or anything?
Okay, so that's a really great question. So the question is basically, should you slow the rep down? Does that make a big difference? And then also, should you focus on it?
Yeah.
Okay, so
focus on the negative or the contraction more effective?
Okay, so if I were to ask everyone, what part of the rep caused you to grow the most, up or down, on the way down? You say eccentric, right? Here's the thing, okay? I'm going to throw like a wrench in there real quick. If you look at the studies on eccentric versus concentric, guess where you can lift more? Eccentrically or concentrically? Eccentrically. In the studies where you see more protein synthesis and more muscle growth eccentrically, they're lifting a higher load eccentrically than concentrically. Because you can. So in other words, they'll go 80% of their eccentric 1RM versus 80% of their concentric 1RM. Well, 80% of your concentric 1RM is really like 50 or 60% of your eccentric 1RM. See where I'm headed with this? In those studies, you see greater hypertrophy, greater protein synthesis. When you take the concentric 1RM and you have them do that eccentrically at like 80% compared to 80% concentrically versus eccentrically, no difference. And in fact, there's greater protein synthesis in the concentric because concentrics work in a higher percentage of your 1RM. Do you see what I'm saying? So what I'm basically saying is this. When the only way to get that greater effect eccentrically is to overload it. That means like a force negative, right? So if I'm doing a curl and my partner presses down, now I'm simulating the study. If I'm slowing the rep down, that's not going to mimic those studies, and I'm not going to get any benefits. Oh my God, I'm growing on the eccentric shoulders. No, it doesn't work that way. And the other thing, so it's eccentric overloading that works. The other thing is that slowing the rep, I think you should control the rep, but slowing it down actually might lead to less. I'm going to do a bench press, okay? An internal cue would be like focus on my triceps, which most people wouldn't necessarily do on a bench press. But if I focus on my triceps, you'll see more muscle activation on triceps, less on the chest. If I focus on my chest, you'll see more activation on the chest, less on the triceps. Okay? But I will not be as strong. So for bodybuilding purposes, it might help me if I want to bring out my pecs. If I focus on pushing the weight toward the ceiling, I'll be stronger because I have more evenly distributed force. I might be using my legs, I might be using my chest, I might be using my shoulders. So for bodybuilding, the focus will dictate where the tension goes. For powerlifting, you're going to be stronger with an external focus. So that would be my thing. So focusing does make an impact for bodybuilding or strength for that matter.
I was going to add to that too. If you do really, really slow negatives, if you want to hit a set of 10 and you're doing these like 8-second negatives with it, the load you're going to use is so much less than the load you would be using just doing a normal, 2-second negative controlled rep. And that's going to lower the amount of total volume, like weights times reps times sets you're doing. And volume is such a key driver of growth that you're almost limiting your growth by going too slow on your reps. Didn't Brad just publish something on that? Yeah, I thought so. I thought I just read that. Brad Schoenfeld has a new paper on some of that. It's actually pretty interesting.
So does it matter like if I'm doing a bicep curl or a tricep push down extension or whatnot? By me holding for 2 or 3 seconds, getting squeezed, does that really make that much of a difference than me just going down, popping, and coming right back up?
That's a good question. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, if you did it on every single rep, though, it would, again, kind of like it would reduce the load again. I mean, and maybe it's an advanced intensity technique you throw in once in a while, or maybe you do it on the last rep.
Hey, but totally, bro. No one's tested this, but we're actually, the guy in my lab, Chase, is actually going to test intraset flexing. So, I mean, that's the kind of lab we kind of have. We're actually, I'll let you guys know next year.
Thank you.
Okay,
I think one thing too that people don't concentrate on, so we're talking about biceps, triceps, but maybe it's back training. It's actually use intent. And what intent is actually activating the muscle that you're getting ready to do the rep with first. And there was a lot of work done, I think, with Ben in your lab where they tested that. So, like if you're going to do a row, a lot of people start here and they come back and then they focus on the squeeze. But using intent, a good idea is to actually start here, squeeze your back, and then start the row. So you can use intent with almost every single exercise, and I think that goes a long way when you're talking about contraction, the eccentric portion, the whole 9 yards. Throwing intent in there is something that can take someone that's just getting started and not using intent maybe to the next level to help with more hypertrophy over time. Okay, another question?
I guess this is for anybody, but I don't think John or Cliff really implement this in their training, but what do you guys think about like fascia stretching? I know, like anecdotally, we have, I think, John Perillo kind of came out with the active stretching, and then not to be done with the weighted stretching, and then like Kenny Rombach with his FST7, which that's kind of on a different end. And they all have like their anecdotal reasons of why stretching with fascia from like, because the only point of view, I just can't see that happening, but I think it was Jose Antonio was on, he was a part of the vertebrae stretch protocol where they actually did muscle biopsies, and it actually did show hyperplasia. So does that, would that study, if you're familiar with that, would that translate to actual in-gym, real-world results, or is it just not practical for us to replicate that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely convinced that it's, like you said,
theory,
fascia stretching. If anything, I would say that the stretch is probably just inducing greater damage to the muscle, therefore leading to growth. I mean, that would be my take on it. I think if you're, at least in my opinion, what I do with my own clients, but if you're running through a full range of motion with heavy weight, then you're going to get significant stretching if volume is where it needs to be. I can't say I'm necessarily against it, but I'm so far, I'm not entirely convinced it'll make that big of a difference, but that's just me.
I know myself, I've looked at some of the research, and I know your lab has looked at this a lot. And I like it, I like the idea of it, especially like, say you have stomach calves, right? And use intraset stretching and you haven't been doing that. I'd like to see more research on it. I can't recall it off the top of my head, but I know you have data on that to go along with Jose's, so I know you can chime in. I know one thing, it hurts like hell when you do it, like it is no joke.
Would that need to be weighted then at a pace?
Yeah, so maybe you're doing, calf raises, right, on the chair, and you're loaded up on your knees, and you do your sets, and then in between, you drop it down, you let the weight press down and stretch your calves for maybe a 30-second hold, and it's brutal, and then you go back to finish out your sets, and then you just static hold. There's different ways to do it, and I know you implemented it with your push-pull legs split that you put on bodybuilding.com. I don't know what the research lately says. Jake can tell you that, but to me, it looks promising. So it's something I'm very interested in, but I'll let them know what the research says.
Sure, like for you guys who don't have a background, you talked about Joey Antonio's study. For you guys who don't have a background in Jose Antonio, so I must have been like in high school or something when I read this. But anyway, so basically I read this paper, and so Dr. Antonio published a paper, and he took birds, okay, and he hung weights on their wings, and basically he hung them for several days, sometimes weeks, and they got jacked. Okay, and I was fascinated when I read this. I was like, wow, In the literature, since high school all the way till now, I have not read any study anywhere that's shown more hypertrophy than that research. You go look and you look at the pictures, it is ridiculous. But it wasn't just like hypertrophy, like you pointed out. The muscle fibers themselves actually split, and they actually added muscle fibers. So basically what John was talking about was this intraset stretching protocol. Now obviously, it's going to be hard to like hang a weight from you for that long. But man, if you had like a body part you wanted to grow, I don't know. But what we did was we took this and we did the intraset stretching protocol in our lab, like John said. We had people do calf raises, just like he said, where they went to failure. And when they went to failure, instead of just dropping the weight to the next thing, they held the stack. They let the stack push them down for 30 seconds. And then they stripped the weight and they kept going. And then you let the stack push you down for 30 seconds. Or if you're doing quads, like Chris talked about, I was talking with him yesterday, when you do squats or you do leg press, you go to failure and then you sit on your knees and lean back and stretch it. I don't think the mechanism, like Cliff says, it's probably not related to fascia. I think it's probably related to damage. And I think tension.
Yeah, because tension can induce protein synthesis. You can stretch a muscle cell in culture and not damage it and induce protein synthesis.
100%.
I have one question. I'm not that familiar with it. I've only read a little bit about that stuff, but what is it about doing that makes it that safe to do? Because I don't have people stretch before working out because I think they could tear something, right? The actin and myosin separating. So is it that it's already overlapped and warm and that makes it safe to do?
Well, I think if you were overloaded with extreme weights, it's going to be somewhat dangerous. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that you're usually using it as a finisher.
So you're already warmed up.
You're warmed up. You're using it as a finisher. You're not lifting as heavy a weights at that time. And you're using exercises that are somewhat safe. So, for example, if you're doing leg press, it's probably not necessarily safe to. You got to be careful with letting the weight, stretch you. Whereas if you're doing calf raises, that's probably safe. You know what I mean? But that's why, like Chris pointed out, you do a leg press and then you sit on your knees and lean back. You can sort of tailor how much load you're putting on yourself. You know what I mean? Assisted. I do think that it being weighted is important because studies that don't weight the stretch, you don't really see the hypertrophy. So I think the weighted part, like Peter said, is a tension issue. And tension is one of the major mechanisms for hypertrophy. If you guys are lifting at night or something like that, the first place that you try it on your calves first, it's agony. And then try it with a different part. Like if you try it with like chest, if you do it on flies, triceps, and then progress to like quads. So.
More questions? Right.
All right, so if you've been lifting, to say for 5 years or more, naturally, you're going to probably gain about 1 pound of muscle a year. So if you break that down daily, you're talking about like 1/365th of a pound a day or so. So that brings up a question of like, everyone's talking about when to eat and timing all of it appropriately. And I guess I start saying, well, if you're talking about 1/365th of a pound, how much does that really make a difference? I mean, obviously, if you're not taking the extremes. I'm just kind of curious about thoughts.
Okay, I'll start that one off. So, obviously, someone that's very well trained, it takes a long time to build muscle, especially if you're natural. So, how important is it to like dot your T's and cross, dot your I's, cross your T's, the whole 9 yards? Actually, I think it's more important when you're that advanced because all of those little things add up at the end of the day because you're going to fight your ass off to get that pound or two of muscle. So that's where you really want to dial it in to where if you're a newbie and you make those newbie gains, you can get away with not being so accurate or so anal. Like one of the most advanced athletes I know is like Matt Holcomb. Matt's been training for a long time, and for him to fight to put on stage weight, like he does everything to a T, even in the offseason. Like his protein levels are spot on. He's not going to go have 20 grams of protein per meal because he knows he needs more leucine. He knows he needs to keep protein synthesis elevated to get enough gains over the course of time. So I think that's extremely important the more well-trained you are.
I think it's kind of a funny question because, I mean, honestly, that's kind of the big question is how much of a difference does it make? And the group that cares about it most are advanced athletes. But, you know, when guys like these do their research, the progress is so slow you almost can't measure it on advanced athletes. So then it becomes the question of, you know, what does work and what doesn't work. I always like to take the approach that if something may offer a benefit, but doesn't even bring with it the possibility of a detriment, I'm going to try it. I mean, that's just kind of my approach with it because, you know, if you can get even a little bit out of it without any possible detriment, go for it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I mean, I think that, you know, there's stuff, if there's a possibility that something may work, I mean, and there's not a possibility that it's going to make anything worse, I mean, go for it. But kind of like I said in my talk, you know, we're talking advanced athletes. You know, like I kind of said with the lifestyle part of my talk, you know, someone who's a beginner, someone who's younger, you know, for them, just getting them started, getting them into just getting the basics right. You don't want to worry about all these little details with someone who's just getting started. You don't want to blow them away. They're going to hate everything. Like, you want them to keep lifting for a long period of time. Do the basics right. You know, they're going to get you quite a ways. I mean, there are things we know definitely work. Higher protein intakes, you know, training body parts, progressive overload, you know, things like that work. Focus on those things first, and then as you get it more advanced, you know, maybe work in some of these things that maybe they work, maybe they don't, but as long as they're not going to hurt you and they're not going to suck, like you're not going to hate doing them because they're so tedious and you're going to make your life miserable. I mean, try it, see what happens. Maybe it's great, maybe you notice nothing and you just are like, yeah, well, I'm not going to do that anymore.
Kind of about the same topic. Do you guys feel that meal frequency is more important as a more advanced lifter? So if you're a noob and you're having the right amount of protein per day for your weight, and you're doing that in 2 or 3 meals, compared to an advanced lifter doing that in 6 meals just to stimulate muscle protein synthesis more times per day. It's getting super detailed, but do you think that 1% each day might have a benefit at the end of the year?
Okay, so meal frequencies are really difficult. Yeah. So we published a position stand in ISSN, right? If you look through all the literature on meal frequency, maybe 90% of it doesn't support it being beneficial. But I'm gonna emphasize something on this. If you look at those studies, they're using the RDA for protein, which was never meant to emphasize to do any. That's 0.8 grams per kilogram. That's like, you know, like no one in this room is going to eat 0.8 grams per kilogram protein. It's just not going to happen. So, but basically, what ends up happening is they'll take that amount. So you might get like, you're getting 20 grams of protein, 30 grams of protein a meal. And then they'll spread that over like 7 meals. So now you're getting what, like 10 grams of protein a meal? And they go, oh, higher meal frequencies don't work as good as less meal frequencies. Yeah, because you never hit the protein threshold you need to turn on protein synthesis, ever. So of course, that's going to not be beneficial. Then they'll also cite elderly studies where basically they'll take the RDA again, and they'll go, a pulse feeding, where you take most of their 80% of the protein feed with 1 meal, is better than feeding them with 3 meals. Well, yeah, because the elderly don't respond to protein as well, so you need a larger dose, and 1 larger dose is better than 3 inferior doses. If you look at, there's a study by Douglas, Patton, Jones, and they gave 3 meals, and in between meals, they gave amino acids enough to hit the leucine threshold, like over 3 grams, or it was 10 to 15 grams of essential amino acids, but over 3 grams of leucine, and they had greater protein balance at the end of the day. So, what I'm saying is it could be beneficial that even if you're having 3 meals a day, maybe having branched chain amino acids between meals could mimic that meal frequency effect. You know, that would be kind of my position.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the tracer studies too, I mean, there's, just from the acute studies, there's evidence that too little or too high of meal frequencies, either direction, can be detrimental. And so, I mean, really, you know, if someone pigeonholes me into how many times should I eat a day, somewhere between 3 and 6 probably, maybe 4 or 5 based on a lot of these studies, you know, are probably optimal. But again, I don't know. You know, long-term studies, I don't know. There just isn't a lot of data that really supports that.
Yeah, I agree. I think I tend to veer towards 4 or 5. I think with meal frequency, you're just best off avoiding extremes.
Yeah.
If I had to say, I would say probably too many is better than too few. But once again, just that moderate approach. And you talk about whether someone's a beginner. I think with everything, that approach where if somebody's more advanced, the little things become more important because the closer you get to your ultimate potential, that muscle tissue is not quite as necessary as it once was. And, to fight for every little ounce that you're going to go for, you need to do every little thing you can to get that.
I know my clients, most of my clients, usually it's 5 meals and then an intra workout, concoction of BCAAs and dextrose, and then right after post-workout, they have whey. So I kind of consider that a meal. So it's basically 6 meals. And a lot of that's just because most people, most of us, we just want to eat more often because the last thing we want to do is wait longer. However, I do think 4 or 5 is probably more beneficial. The thing with me is it's all about how much leucine someone's getting per meal, because if you're not hitting that threshold. So for example, maybe a female figure competitor weighs 120 pounds, is eating 120 grams of protein a day, spread out into 6 meals. So she's only getting 20 grams of protein a day. If she has whey at that meal, the leucine threshold is pretty decent, but if she has something like chicken, the leucine threshold at 20 grams of protein is definitely not enough to get that leucine threshold into spike protein synthesis. So I think that's a great place for people to supplement with branched chain amino acids. And that's some thoughts. I know you recommend, I don't know if you still do, maybe branched chain amino spread out throughout the day if someone's protein is a little lower like that, to maybe get the leucine threshold up. But to me, it all comes down to spiking protein synthesis, because if you're not maximizing, you're leaving muscle growth and repair on the table if your protein's lower. So I think it's especially important for women to make sure they pay attention to that.
Yeah, I was gonna say I've worked with a couple of vegan clients, and for them, I do BCA supplementation with meals because they're not having any meat or dairy. They don't have any of these high leucine complete sources of protein, and so, I mean, even if you do complementary proteins, a lot of times it's really hard to hit that leucine threshold. So I'll have them supplement BCAAs with meals when I'm working with someone like that.
Right. So think about a female, right? Maybe she eats something that's high in protein for a carb source like oatmeal, and she's having 40 grams of carbs from oatmeal at a meal. Protein is like 5, 6, 7 grams, something like that. That's like, that protein is there's hardly any leucine in it at all. So then if you're only having 20 grams of protein at that meal, you only have like 14 to get from chicken. Then it's even lower. So like your protein sources are extremely important per meal as well to make sure leucine's elevated. If it's not, then that's a good place for branched chain amino acids. So, Abu?
How important is your genetics when you're going to gaining muscle far, slow, fast, or
I'm sorry, but Cliff probably has the worst genetics out of anybody I've ever met. But
Yeah.
he's also put on more muscle with someone with shit genetics than I've ever met.
Yeah.
So like, this is
It's-
the perfect person to answer that.
It's, I hate to say it, it's almost everything. It really is. I mean, I'll use myself as an example. And it's, as a coach, I've worked with some particularly elite clients. And for myself, I've been weight training about 12 years now. I have competed in 5 different contests, and I've never won my class. I've come close to turning pro a few times. I have coached some 23-year-olds that have lifted weights for about 13 months, and they win their pro card first time out. And most of that time, they were doing things completely wrong. It means, it's the same way LeBron James could probably never practice and he would still make it to the NBA. It's just kind of the way it goes. I think it's just important that everybody maximizes what they have. And I'll say something also, that those with lesser genetics, lesser bodybuilding genetics, and trust me, I know about that pretty well. But the problem is, I think a lot of people that don't have genetics particularly suited for the sport, there's a certain victimized mentality that comes with it, and it almost compounds the problem. There are a lot of people that have poor bodybuilding genetics. That's one of the first things they'll talk about, and I'm not really a big fan of that. I don't like to make those excuses. And you'll find that even if you have poor genetics for, you know, the sport, with consistency and extremely hard work and time, you can still do some pretty good things. But, you know, it doesn't mean you'll ever be able to beat some of those genetic elite people. Unfortunately, the truth of the sport is that there are certain people that on the best day of your career, you'll never beat them on the worst day of their career. And, you know, that's the harsh reality of it, but, you know, we all have, it's kind of like that with life. You know, some people are born with extremely rich parents and some are born with nothing. So, you know, you just got to make the most of what you have and keep going. Don't worry about the stuff you can't change.
Yeah, I think it's important. I worked with people on both sides of this, genetically elite and then people with shit genetics. And one of the things that frustrates me is a lot of people that have elite genetics, they think that what they've done is the most optimal, because at the end of the day, a lot of the stuff they do is going to work regardless, right? So what I struggle with is when people have elite genetics, they tend to not like to listen to a lot of the things that have worked for people that have shit genetics. So if we could take an elite genetically gifted athlete and